Hello everyone, I'm Steve, and today I want to share some thoughts on cable management in my first ever PC build. I began buying my PC components and equipment during Black Friday last year in 2018. The majority of my PC parts were bought after Christmas and into January. I built my gaming computer in a Corsair 460X RGB case. The build was much easier than I thought it would be. However, it was cable management that was quite challenging. It took me 3 tries to be satisfied with the results. The first 2 attempts at cable management were probably okay. No one would have noticed anyway. The glass panels for this case are on the front and motherboard side, and not the cable management side. I just had to have another attempt. In this video, I will open up the computer and we will look at how I routed my cables in this final attempt. As you can see, I'm reading from notes, so please forgive any errors that may occur as I try to look into the camera. Let's get started. Okay, let's look inside at the motherboard. Alright, let's point out some of the equipment that we have in here. We have an MSI B450 Tomahawk motherboard. We have an AMD Radeon 5 2600 processor with stock Wraith Stealth cooler. We have 2 Corsair 8GB RGB Pro RAM memory sticks. We have a Samsung 970 EVO 500GB NVMe M.2 SSD installed on the motherboard. We have an MSI RX 580 Armor 8GB OC graphics card. We have added 3 SP120 RGB fans, 2 at the top and 1 at the rear. Now let's look at the attached motherboard cables. We have the motherboard 24-pin ATX power cable coming through the second rubber grommet and connected at ATX_PWR1. We have the motherboard 8-pin CPU power cable at the top left on the motherboard. It routes through a specific backplate hole in the top left and connects to CPU_PWR1. We have the graphics card 8-pin GPU power cable coming out of the power supply and HDD shroud hole. Here's the hole. It connects to the right of the GPU. We have the front panel HD audio cable at the bottom far left of the motherboard. Of course, here's the front panel. It comes out of the shroud hole and connects at JAUD1. We have the front panel cables for power switch, reset switch, HDD, and power switch lights at the bottom center of the motherboard. Of course, the front panel. And these are the curly Q cables right here. It comes out of the shroud hole and connects at JFP1. We have the Commander Pro USB 2.0 data cable at the bottom center of the motherboard. It comes out of the shroud hole and is connected at JUSB 1. I'll show the Commander Pro when the case is turned around. We have the front panel dual USB 3.0 cable at the bottom center of the motherboard and slightly to the right. Of course, here's the front panel. It comes out of the shroud hole and is connected at JUSB 3. We have the 2.5-inch SSD SATA data cable coming through the bottom rubber grommet. It's connected at SATA port 3, which is directly under SATA port 4 and is the bottom set of ports on this side of the motherboard. Note that SATA ports 1 and 2 are disabled due to the M.2 SSD. These are the top set of ports on this side of the motherboard. Here's the M.2 SSD, and it disables ports 1 and 2. They're above 3 and 4. We have the stock cooler fan cable coming out the left side of the fan and circling around the top heatsink. It's connected at CPU_fan 1. We have the 2 top and single rear fans with 2 cables each, and also 2 thermal sensors for top and rear exhaust. These are all routed through the same specific hole as the CPU power cable. Okay, let's take a look at the front of the case. Here you can see the tempered glass front panel. I'm going to remove it to show you a thermal sensor. You can see we have this magnetic dust filter. You can see right through there we have a thermal sensor. And that thermal sensor will be measuring inlet air temperature. Alright, let's look at the rear of the case. I'm going to go ahead and turn off the computer. Alright, here at the rear of the computer, you can see we also have a thermal sensor. This will be measuring rear outlet temperature. This is not going to be seen because the rear is going to be facing the wall. Alright, let's look at the top of the computer. Okay, here we have the top of the computer, and you can see we also have a magnetic dust filter. Let's go ahead and remove that. And as you can see, we've got a thermal sensor here. It'll measure top exhaust temperature. Okay, let's remove the back panel and look inside the case behind the motherboard. Okay, let's look at the back of the case here. Note that we have removed the 3-button RGB controller and associated cable. This controller was connected to the front panel buttons for basic color changes. These buttons no longer work. Of course, the buttons are up here, and that controller was mounted right here. Also note that we have removed the 3 SSD racks to accommodate better cable management and placement of a Corsair Commander Pro. This is right here is the area where the 3 SSD racks were. And you can see we've installed our Commander Pro. The IQ software will now control computer color schemes via the Commander Pro. We have a Corsair RM650X 650 watt power supply. We have a pre-installed Corsair 6-fan RGB hub. We have a Samsung 860 EVO 500 GB 2.5-inch SATA SSD installed in the top slide-out rack of the HDD cage. You can see that the bottom is empty. Note that the cage has been moved forward to make more room for cables coming out of the power supply area. There are 2 notches, and we have moved the cage forward to the first notch. Okay, let's look at any possible bulges to the back panel. I've got a ruler here, and I'm going to slide it along this area, and you can see that it touches the Commander Pro. I've kind of roughly measured that, and it's about 1/16 of an inch, maybe a little bit more. So my cable management plan was to get all the cables to lay flatter than the Commander Pro, or at least have some give so that the back panel would push the cables in. Alright, let's place this ruler along the Commander Pro and see if it touches anything else. In particular, this 24-pin motherboard ATX cable. That's going to be most likely our problem area. Okay, it's touching a cable right there that's being routed along there. There's some give right there. That'll be pushed in. Okay, we're fine right there. Okay, there's a spot right there. Now, can we push that in? Yes, we can push that in. There's another spot right there, and that is not going to be pushed in. So if we have a bulge in our case, it's probably going to be right there. And everywhere else, I think we're fine. Now right there's a little spot, but that pushes in. And we have a SATA connector here that sticks out, but that pushes in also. All right, let's look at the power supply cables first. We have a CPU power cable marked in yellow. It routes from behind the power supply area, above the RGB hub, and up the rear of the case. We have the motherboard ATX power cable marked in blue. It routes from behind the power supply area straight up the middle of the back plate and then left into the rubber grommet. There are no tie points, so we used Velcro. Moving the HDD cage forward allowed the metal divider between the HDD and power supply to be exposed. This is used as a tie point. We have the graphics card power cable marked in green. Very little routing was needed as most of the cable is in the front. The little bit of slack was pushed into the power supply area. We have a single SATA power cable for both the Commander Pro and RGB hub marked in red. This cable has 3 SATA connection points and is routed from power supply area along the bottom of the case toward the right and then loop back toward the left. It was routed under the CPU and motherboard power cables and midway up beside the motherboard cable. Note the first unused SATA connector is hidden behind the CPU cable in the power supply area. Note the second SATA connector at the bottom where the RGB hub is connected. Note the third and last SATA connector at the top where the Commander Pro is connected. There are no tie points here, so we used Velcro also. We have the Commander Pro and RGB hub cables to connect to the SATA power cable. They're marked in red. The RGB hub cable is looped one time horizontally and connected at the bottom SATA connector. The Commander Pro cable is looped vertically and then down to the last SATA connector. We have the 2.5-inch SSD SATA power cable marked in red. It routes from the power supply area and is looped along the inside of the bottom of the case, also toward the right and then back toward the left. It is looped inside the unused bottom HDD slide-out rack. The first two SATA connectors are in the cage area, and the third SATA connector connects directly to the SSD. Okay, all the rest of the cables are either routed by themselves or routed under the power supply cables, or routed alongside the power supply cables. Let's look at the RGB hub cables next. We have RGB lighting cables 4, 5, and 6 marked in blue. There's 4, 5, and 6 marked in blue. They route out the bottom and up the rear of the case. Any looping required occurs vertically along the rear of the case. We have RGB lighting cables 1, 2, and 3 marked in blue. There's 1, 2, and 3 marked in blue. They are routed out the top and horizontally all the way to the front of the case, and then vertically up the front of the case. Any looping occurs vertically along the front of the case. There are plenty of tie points along this route. We have the LED data cable out the right side, marked in white. This cable is routed out the right and looped up along the rear of the case and then back down to connect to the Commander Pro at LED 1. There's LED 1. Okay, let's look at the Commander Pro cables next. We have fan control cables 4, 5, and 6 marked in green. There's 4, 5, and 6 marked in green. They route out the bottom and up the rear of the case. Any looping required occurs vertically along the rear of the case. We have fan control cables 1, 2, and 3 marked in green. There's 1, 2, and 3 marked in green. They route out the bottom and horizontally all the way to the front of the case and then vertically up the front of the case. Any looping occurs vertically along the front of the case. There are plenty of tie points along this route. We have thermal sensor cables 3 and 4 marked in yellow. There's 3 and 4 marked in yellow. They route out the top and up the rear of the case. Any looping required occurs vertically along the rear of the case. We have thermal sensor cables 1 and 2 marked in yellow. There's 1 and 2 marked in yellow. They route to the left and down behind the SATA power cable. The sensor to the HDD rack is then routed horizontally and down inside the HDD cage. Any looping occurs horizontally. The front inlet sensor is routed horizontally and then vertically. Any looping occurs vertically. There are plenty of tie points along this route. We have the USB data cable marked in white. It is routed to the left, up the 24-pin ATX power cable, and then down the SATA power cable and into the power cable area. This cable goes through the power supply shroud hole to the motherboard. Okay, let's look at the large front panel cables next. We have the HDD audio cable and dual USB 3.0 cable. They are routed alongside and down the 24-pin ATX power cable into the power supply area. These cables go through the power supply shroud hole to the motherboard. Let's look at the small HDD and power lighting cables and push button cables. These are the 4 curly front panel cables. They are routed down the front of the case and then horizontally to just above the power supply area. These cables go through the power supply shroud hole to the motherboard. Note the unused front panel RGB 3-button control cables. They are loosely routed up to the top of the case. Recall that those were unhooked from the 3-button controller that we removed from this area. Finally, let's look at the 2.5-inch SATA data cable. This cable is marked in white. It is routed vertically alongside the SATA power cable and looped around and routed through the bottom rubber grommet to the motherboard. Okay, let's button up and see where any bulges are detected. Alright, let's use our ruler again and we'll slide it around here. It's flat up here as we expected. Looks flat right here also. Still looks flat. Still flat. And as we expected, right in here, there must be a bulge because you can see the ruler has some give right there. So as we expected, we've got a bulge here. taking a look at it, I can't feel it, and I certainly can't see that. So that must not be too bad. Alright, that's all my comments on cable management for this Corsair 460X RGB case. I hope this video will be helpful for anyone building their first PC in this case. Thanks for your time, and bye for now.